Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Poonam Yadav, ACM W UK Chair and Lecturer at University of York. My co-host is Anastasia Nazrova, Project Coordinator at ACM W UK Chapter. It's my great pleasure to invite today our speaker, Dr. Hatice Gunes, Reader at Computer Science Department at Cambridge University. Today's topic is artificial emotional intelligence for well-being. Without taking much of our time, let me invite Dr. Gunes to start her presentation.
Hello everyone, I'm Hatice Gunes. I'm a reader in Affective Intelligence and Robotics in the University of Cambridge's Department of Computer Science and Technology. And today I'll be talking about artificial emotional intelligence for well-being. Here we see two aspects of how we communicate nonverbal social signals. So we have a sender of the signals, and then we have a receiver of the signals. And these social signals are constantly being emitted by the sender and also constantly being interpreted by the receiver, whether we are conscious of it or not. So the way we walk, the way we talk, the way we actually seat ourselves, position ourselves in terms of distance, angle, our expressivity, gaze, our clothes, everything speaks about us. And then this can be also interpreted in terms of how the receiver end forms impressions based on these cues, how the receiver end again interprets emotions, whether the person can persuade the other person, and so on. So all of these contribute to this aspect of nonverbal social signals. And emotional intelligence does relate to all of these aspects, but this talk and my research in particular focuses on these two specific aspects, which is forming impressions and how we express emotions and affect. Then artificial emotional intelligence can be interpreted in terms of these three specific aspects. So eliciting expressions, regulating attention. So this also means whether an artificial system or an interface can draw out a reaction in the human users. The second aspect relates to whether the systems or these artificial interfaces can express emotions and social signals that can be identified by the humans. And the final and third aspects relates to endowing these systems with the capabilities of automatically detecting emotions and social signals of humans. So let's look at these three aspects with different examples. So the first example comes from a new project I was involved in. It's about creating sensitive artificial listeners. So here we will give the examples of artificial emotional intelligence in terms of all these three different aspects. So here, this system uses a communication-driven model. So the sensitive artificial listener system has 4 characters. So we have Poppy, Spike, Obadiah, and Prudence. And each of them have different personalities. So Poppy is very cheerful, Spike is angry and spiteful, and Obadiah is somewhat depressed and sad, and Prudence is, as a matter of fact, and pragmatic. And this was actually a first fully automatic system to engage the humans in a sustained interaction, conversational interaction, and to interpret their nonverbal behaviors, and based on only the nonverbal behavior interpretation, to keep the conversation going and to sustain the interaction with the user. So here the focus was on 2 modalities, so vision and audio. So here you see how the user is sensed through this camera and the microphone. Features are extracted. First at the low level, these are analyzed, and then various aspects are fused together, and the consolidated analysis is sent to the interpreters. So the interpreters are part of the dialogue management, so they contribute to the understanding of the dialogue. So here the understanding would be what the user state is, what the agent state is, what the dialogue state is, and based on understanding what the user now is expressing, deciding on what would be the appropriate action on the virtual agent side. So this leads to synthesis and generation aspects, and an appropriate action and appropriate audio or speech is also played in response to the user. and this continues, so it's a closed loop interaction. Here's one example. I'll be playing the video, but also you can see from YouTube as well. The link is provided here.
Well, I'm Spike.
Well, I'm
What's your
Spike.
problem?
What's your problem?
I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem.
Throw the user into their own emotional state. So Spike would understand the user is nodding their head, but would do the opposite to keep the person angry, or would interrupt as they're talking. An example application of such virtual agents can be basically the Sim Sensei that was created in the University of Southern California. So this was of course much later compared to the main sensitive artificial listener project. But the idea here was to have virtual humans for healthcare support in clinical settings. So this is a direct application of such artificially emotionally intelligent systems applied in clinical settings. So I would like to now focus a bit more on the second part, so expressing emotions and social signals that can be identified by humans. There are many theories about emotion. So here I will just mention a couple, the most popularized views, particularly for computer science. So Darwin's theory is one of those. So Darwin traveled around and looked at how animals and humans express emotions through their face, their body, their gestures. And he came up with the hypothesis or idea that these are relevant for solving evolutionary problems. But since then, particularly in the last 20-25 years, the understanding and the importance of emotions in terms of psychology research, but even computer science, has evolved a lot. And we now know that emotions contribute to almost all aspects of our lives, to our cognition, decision-making, attention, motivation, and all of these things. So the expression of emotions can be done with various channels. So we can have the nonverbal internal aspects, such as physiological signals. So we can express emotions through our breathing, the heart rate increasing, even brain signals. The most common channel for expressing emotions is the visual one. So then we can express with body signals like posture, gait, gesture, as you see here. But the face is the notably most important and most communicated and used channel for expressing emotions. And here you see the 6 basic categories of emotions popularized by Ekman. These are fear, anger, sadness, disgust, joy, and surprise. Here you see the very exaggerated, blown up aspects of these facial expressions of emotions. However, there are some criticisms related to Ekman's theory of universality. So basically the 6 basic emotion categories cannot represent all the different variety of feelings and expressions we have in daily life. And also not every emotion is a distinct facial expression. For instance, emotions or affective states such as awe, guilt, or shame. Just came up with the representation of emotions as dimensions. So here we see Russell's circumflex. So this constitutes of 2 dimensions: valence, which relates to how negative or positive the emotion is, and arousal, how active or inactive the emotion is. And if necessary, we can also map various categories to dimensional representation. So I will open up this creating artificial emotional intelligence aspect a bit more. So basically we have the user, and the idea is to sense the user multimodally. Then of course we would need to use some of the aspects I just covered in terms of these theories in social sciences, and we need to acquire data. Usually this data needs to be annotated as well, either by self-report or independent observers. Then we need to extract features to be used for training or creating models for recognition and prediction, and we need to do the performance evaluation. Changing aspects of machine learning, some of these have been combined into a single end-to-end model with deep learning. But it doesn't stop there. Once, for instance, we identify the person is smiling, the next thing is to try to understand in a context-sensitive manner, what does this mean? So a person might be smiling because they're ashamed, so it might be a smile of embarrassment, or it might be a smile of joy. And the only way to understand this is to understand the context, and that means W5 plus questions and trying to answer them. So where the user is, what the user is doing, how they're feeling, what their personality is, what their tasks are, and so on. And once we have this interpretation, then we can create context-sensitive responding. In this case, the example is virtual reality related gaming environment. So here, if we can sense the user, we can tailor the virtual reality environment based on what we sensed and interpreted about the user. And this brings me to the part of the talk that I will be talking for cognitive training. So this relates to affective virtual reality gaming. So the motivation for this research is related to dementia. So we started working on this with neuroscientists in Cambridge who work with people prone to dementia. And the main challenge there is there are some cognitive training related interventions, and some of these have been computerized and people have been starting to use those. But there are challenges with the traditional computerized approaches as well, because after a while they are repetitive and adherence is low, so people start dropping out. And virtual reality, because of this immersive and engaging aspect, has been considered as a potential solution. So the study was conducted with 30 participants. There was a custom-made game called Memory Break, and to understand the effect of virtual reality, this was implemented both in desktop and VR setting. First of all, before the participants started with the study, their working memory capacity was measured using automated operation span. And then once they were playing, they also reported their affective states by completing, again, standardized questionnaires related to in-game experience. So the game Memory Break, simply to describe, here you see two participants playing, one the desktop version, the other one is playing in the VR version. So the idea is that the people go through the game, and there are different aspects of it. So as they move around the game, they can collect points, diamonds, they throw the ball, and then at some point there will be a door that opens, and once the door opens there will be some characters coming out, and then they will need to remember these characters, and the gameplay will continue, and after a while they'll be asked to enter those characters in order, and depending on how they perform they will get certain points and so on. So first of all, based on their original working memory capacity baseline, participants were divided into two groups. So the ones with high working memory and the ones with low working memory. Here you see how basically the performance of people are in terms of low and high working memory capacity in desktop and VR conditions. And we also have the different difficulty level of the game. So we have level 1 is easier, and then the difficulty of the game increases. So what we see here is basically participants with low working memory have a significantly better working memory performance when they play in VR. So we can see the difference when we compare to desktop setup. And this is particularly pronounced when we look at level 2 in red and level 1 in red, and then level 2 in green. Then if you look at the relationship between working memory and valence and arousal, what we see is that valence level is significantly correlated with working memory performance, and the participants achieve their best working memory performance when both valence and arousal are high. So we can see this in terms of the different groups, but again we see particularly for the low working memory capacity group how this is increasing. So particularly for level 1 and level 2, we see how this is actually increasing with valence and arousal being high. And for level 3, we start seeing some aspect related to arousal is still high because obviously the difficulty is increasing, but there is some decrease in valence. and we will explain this a bit later. So the idea with the gaming is related to the flow theory. So we would like to keep the players in a constant state of flow, and this is a region that is not easy to get to. Basically, it means that the player's ability is used to their full potential, so they're not getting bored, but at the same time, even though they're getting challenged, they're not really falling into the region where the difficulty is much higher than they can cope with, and therefore start feeling anxiety. So the goal is really to keep them in this state of flow, which is something good to aspire to, but it's not very easy. So what we can say from the study is that working memory performance can really improve when the player is in a state of enjoyment. But as we saw in the level 3, they start getting quite tense and start to fall into this region where the anxiety possibly arises. We can see that in the other hand. And therefore, when we talked about this aspect of level 3, we were looking how at level 3 valence starts decreasing, is because they start feeling quite tense and the enjoyment level is starting to decrease. So the next study is addressing these challenges. The idea here is to add this aspect of automatically classifying the affective state of the user, and based on this create a game adaptation. And of course the rest we will have again, the adaptation will act as stimuli to the player, and then this will create some response in the player. In this case we are looking at physiological sensor, and this data from the physiological sensor needs to be assessed and then fed into the affect classification component. So in this study we focused on 2 tasks. So working memory task, to assess this task, the idea was to create a virtual supermarket. So this is more realistic because people with potential deficits related to their memory would still need to do day-to-day activities like going to the supermarket or visiting a museum. Therefore, the episodic memory task relates to creating a virtual multi-room museum. So here you see the supermarket task. So the idea is that the person is wearing a headset, and they also have 2 motion sensing controllers. So they use these controllers, and once they start the game, they have a list of items that they need to remember and to get from the supermarket. And they also have a basket, and with the controller they can pick the items. They also see the score every time they actually pick the right item, what sort of score they're getting, and they can move around the supermarket. So the second one relates to the episodic memory task. So this is in the museum. So the person enters the museum, and there are certain items in the museum that they need to remember where their location is, because after a certain time these items will be taken off or will disappear, and the person will go back to the entrance of the museum, and they need to walk around and remember which item's location was where. And again, they'll get certain scores for correctly placing the right items. So in terms of data acquisition, there were 18 participants in total, and the idea was to sense their facial expressions, but in VR the facial expressions are occluded, or the face partially is occluded. Therefore, in collaboration with MTech, we used facial electromyography. So these are basically inserted inside the headset, and they measure the electrical activity of the muscle movements as the person expresses facial actions or facial expressions. And when the people finished certain tasks, they were asked to self-report in terms of how they felt. So they reported in terms of arousal and valence, and again this is in a continuous way, and they can report how they felt. In terms of features, there were time and time frequency domain features. The full set is provided on the right hand side. Also, using the discrete wavelet transform approximation. Classification, the idea was to look at the problem as a two-class problem. We looked at three traditional ways of classifying a facial EMG with this leave one subject out cross-validation strategy. And we see that basically best results are obtained with SVM or KNN, providing around 65% for valence and around 76% for arousal classification. Some of the findings related to asking and interviewing participants once they took part in the study is that majority of them actually preferred the museum environment. So the supermarket felt realistic, but after a while it felt more mundane, as it's basically an environment they're overly familiar with in the real world as well. In terms of task preference, responses were evenly split, so many preferred the episodic memory task because it has more gameplay variety, but others appreciated also the naturalistic aspects in the working memory task, particularly physically touching the items to pick them up, leaning across the shelves and stalls was appreciated by the participants. The next stage was to create this dynamic adaptation. And with adaptation, the goal is to lead the players to a flow state. This was done with a rule set after a short testing period with pilot participants. And here you see how the rule set is created. So if the estimated state, affective state of the user is calm negative and their score is as expected, so perfect score, the difficulty is incremented by 2. So the next one is if their state is calm negative but the score is a bit lower, or they are in a positive valence state and perfect score, the difficulty is increased by 1. If they're in positive valence but they're not scoring very well, we keep it at that level, so there's no change in difficulty. If the score is negative or they are in a negative valence, high arousal and imperfect score, the idea is to decrement it so that they can get to a positive valence. And finally, if they are in high arousal and negative valence state and the score is also negative, so it is going quite badly, let's say, the difficulty is decremented by 2. To assess this, the idea was to do an intervention case study. Of course, here we wanted to recruit as many participants as possible, but this particular one was administered by neuroscience department and with older adults, and it's not always easy to actually get older adults to take part in such studies. So participants played both the adaptive and non-adaptive version to see the differences, and each game session was around 15 minutes. And to make sure there is no order effect, half of them played the adaptive version first. Then again, their experience and the intervention was evaluated with in-game and post-game experience questionnaire, but also they had some other battery of tests administered by the neuroscience department. Here we see some of the findings. So you see for 6 subjects how they reported in terms of their feeling for competence, immersion, flow, tension, challenge, and affect, both negative and positive. So what we see is in the adaptive state, people feel that their potential is utilized much better, so they feel much more competent. The fact that the challenge is decreased together with increase in the feeling of flow means that we are actually managing to keep them in the state of flow as we had originally planned. These findings need to be taken with caution because it's a small set of participants, but it is actually quite encouraging in terms of how affect-based adaptive virtual reality gaming can be used for cognitive training. Now I will touch upon some research we have been doing in terms of human-robot interaction, particularly telepresence robotics. Telepresence robotics relates to humanoid robot avatar. So what this means is the robot is not autonomous or is not fully autonomous. Instead, there is a human operator that is not collocated, and this operator is operating the robot. So telepresence robotics is an alternative means of communication, and particularly during the pandemic it has been used for various things. You might have seen in the news how the robots replaced university students in Zoom graduation ceremonies. in different universities, but also in the UK. You could actually sign up to see certain paintings in the Hastings Contemporary Museum in England via a teleoperated robot, so you can move the robot around to view the paintings. But also in the care homes, it has helped people stay in touch with their loved ones. This is another example. This was before the pandemic. It was an alternative cafe in Tokyo, and here it's staffed by robots, but the robots are controlled by paralyzed people via the interfaces specifically created for them. So the potential of telepresence robotics is enormous. Here I would like to talk a little bit about a recent study we have been doing on creating a robotic coach for mindfulness and well-being. So this study was a longitudinal study. Most of the studies in human-robot interaction are one-off or short-term studies, so longitudinal aspect is in itself a challenge. For 6 weeks, and one session is administered per week, we involved an experienced mindfulness coach to administer the mindfulness sessions, and we had 2 separate groups of participants, one in a room of 4 to 5 people. They face-to-face had the mindfulness session guided by the human coach, and the other set of people just saw the robot that was teleoperated by the human coach in terms of virtual reality headset. In total, we had 19 participants, so it's about 9 to 10 participants per condition, but also we had 2 groups per condition. And we had 3 hypotheses. The first one is that perception scores of human coach do not vary significantly with time. The second one is perception scores of robot coach change significantly with time. And finally, the third hypothesis is mindfulness sessions promote relaxation and calm in both human and robot coach sessions. And for statistical analysis, we use random coefficient modeling. It is useful in analyzing longitudinal data with both inter and intra-individual variability and also missing data points. When people did these sessions, they had to fill in questionnaires, and we provided details of this in the paper, but they had to fill in terms of well-being, how they felt before they started the study. And then each week they also filled other questionnaires before they took the session and after the session. So they filled in session experience questionnaire, the well-being questionnaire, but also filled in personality survey, and also the human coach did the NASA TLX. Here you see for 5 weeks, because the first week was more of a trial, so we analyzed the data along 5 weeks. And the reason that it's not varying with time is because it's an experienced coach, and session themes change, but more or less the way the sessions are conducted are similar, so we don't expect major changes. So qualitatively we can really see that actually the participants rated the robot low in terms of anthropomorphism and animacy, but they rated high for likability and perceived intelligence. The use of robots invoked in people positive response, so the impression scores did not change significantly in time, so that was kept more or less stable, because also the functionality also and the appearance did not change. In terms of conversation and robot motion, actually the changes perceived were significant, and they found to increase over time. So this basically tells us that the participants found the robots moved and interacted more naturally, as well as they found it easier to make a conversation with the robot as the time progressed in terms of number of weeks. And the last one relates to mindfulness sessions promoting relaxation and calm in both human and robot conditions. Here we use the average ratings of the 2 items based on the ratings of the participants in the beginning and the end of the sessions. And we conducted a 2-way repeated measures ANOVA with 1 factor as the week and the other factor as instance, so beginning versus end. So we found a significant effect of instance, so the scores at the end of the session were significantly higher than at the beginning of the session for both groups, for both human and robot groups. So this suggests that the sessions indeed made the participants feel more relaxed and calm by the end of it. But there's no observed effect over time, suggesting actually there are not huge differences of content of each session, which indeed was the case the way it was administered by the human coach. So in conclusion, the robot coach is rated high for likability and perceived intelligence, which reinforces the notion that we can use the robot for such a task. The robot coach is rated low for animacy and anthropomorphism. So this we need to investigate a bit more. Either we need to align the speech to the robot appearance, so it needs to be both robotic, or we need to align the movements of the robot to the human speech and make it more anthropomorphic, so more human-like. Also, participants get more natural feel of the robot with time, which results in an improvement of the interaction. So that's an interesting finding considering the longitudinal aspect of the study. With this study, indeed, actually, we wanted to start focusing on creating a robotic coach gradually. So it's an iterative design. The first one is teleoperated, but as we learned from this, we plan to move towards semi-automated and finally a fully automated robot coach. So based on these aspects that I covered, now I would like to talk a little bit about the challenges of using nonverbal social signals. So I already discussed how we have this aspect of sender and receiver, but if we start replacing either the receiver end or the sender end with an artificial system, robot or artificial character or even interface, there are many challenges, and this is still an ongoing research area, actually, how we can do this to keep the users engaged and to help them succeed better in their task. And this relates to also understanding machine behavior. So machines or systems learn from data. What we can observe about the systems is what the input is to the system and what the output is. So if there are failures, usually failures are linked to the imperfections in the data or the labels, so that's what we can control. Or we talk about the dimensionality and size of the data because we are training machine learning models with those. But we also need to recognize that machine behavior shapes human behaviors, so in both intended and unintended ways. So you may remember the working memory related game level increases to level 3, you start seeing actually how there is tension in the human, the other hand. So indeed, this was not intended in the design of the study, but we start seeing how actually interacting with the system shapes human behavior. We also see that in terms of how it affected the older adults' VR games, so they were feeling actually more competent, so it affects their feelings about themselves. So we need to recognize this aspect about machine behavior. We also need to recognize that machines may exhibit forms of intelligence and behavior. These do not necessarily have to be similar to human behavior. So artificial emotional intelligence is not necessarily the same as human emotional intelligence. So it's really important that we do not make comparisons at that level, and indeed we might not need to have the same sort of emotional intelligence on machines or robots. But there are issues related to this because people who study the behavior of the system, so people who evaluate the systems, are also people at the same time that create the system. So they're people like me, computer science people, but instead machine behavior needs to be studied in a much broader context, possibly involving social scientists. So this should be also explored in a way similarly to how social scientists explore a wide range of human behaviors in different contexts. So if you're interested to find out more about these topics, we did a research topic in Frontiers on Robotics and AI called Affective and Social Signals for Human-Robot Interaction. I have 2 projects still ongoing regarding how we can use artificial emotional intelligence for well-being. So one is a working age, an EU Horizon 2020 project, focusing on people with who are 50 plus and how to empower them in their both work and home environments. And adaptive robotic emotional intelligence for well-being is an ongoing.
Thank you, Professor Hectic, for this very wonderful talk. Now I would like to invite Dr. Hectic to answer some of the questions. So audience, if you have any question, please either. So I'm just going with Magdalene. Can you go back to the second slide? And couldn't catch all of it. The slide with 3 points. So Hectic, do you have a slides handy?
Yes, I'm just going through the slides. Is that the 3 points of artificial emotional intelligence?
I can share this.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
That's the one. Okay, so I'll just share my screen. 1 second. Can you see?
No, I can't see.
Okay. Try again. This time?
Yes.
Yeah, that's the one. Thank you.
So actually, this is based on a chapter. I think I forgot to put there was some. So the reference, in fact, is Thomas et al., but I think I misplaced it. So this doesn't come from me necessarily. But the idea is that, first of all, you need to actually make something in the artificial system that the user should be able to react in some way. So that's the basic one, the first one. So somehow you need to be able to catch the user's attention and then draw some sort of expression out of them, or they need to feel something. So that's the first aspect. And then this can be done, of course, in different ways. You can do it with the appearance. So you can have a very funny robot or very sad character and so on, already before behavior starts. So the physical appearance can even help with this aspect. And then, of course, you can also start doing this with behavior as well. On the interface or the robot or the agent side. The second one is the character or the robot should express these signals in a way that can be identified by humans. So I should be able to, some of this is actually inspired by Disney characters, because Disney worked on this much earlier than robots. So, how do you identify in Disney characters certain aspects? How do you know the character feels now happy or sad or is feeling a bit shy and so on? So sometimes you might need to even exaggerate and magnify those aspects to make sure that people understand what the character is expressing. And the last bit is to automatically detect. This is really important for the closed loop interaction, because if we want fully autonomous agents, systems and robots, they need to automatically detect what the their users are expressing, so that they can actually respond in a sort of appropriate way. And we have the interaction in a closed loop manner. So it keeps going. So constantly there is some expression generated on the agent side based on how the user is expressing their social signal or expressions. This is interpreted by the user side, and again, something else is generated. So it's an ongoing interaction. Does it clarify?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So any more questions? Maybe you can use the reactions or any way to.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah, sure, please.
I have the hand raised on the participants list because you weren't looking. I thought that was really a really nice talk. So thank you for that. I specifically am interested, so I work with EEG data and emotion detection and that sort of thing. So I must admit my connection dropped, and it might drop again because it's been crazy today. So I missed something at the beginning, but I think you mentioned that you've been working with neuroscientists, and I was wondering if you've done some, or you're not interested in looking into that.
Anna, sorry, I think it's just coming and going, so I'm missing keywords of what you're asking. So is your question?
Yeah, my connection is not good. Maybe I'll just.
Sorry, so I will just try to summarize what I understood, and you can say yes or no. Is your question related to whether I worked with EEG data before? Or whether I'm interested in doing research with EEG data? Is that what you're asking?
I guess both. So I was saying I missed a part of the talk because my connection dropped. So I didn't know, you were neuroscientists, and I wasn't sure if you had actually done some EEG work with them, or they were just inspiration for the work, I guess.
So we didn't look at, we looked at physiological signals. So the first study, I'll just share the screen again. So I didn't mention, well, I'm doing the wrong one. Sorry. I get confused with the sharing aspects. 1 second. Too many things around. Okay, so in the first study, in fact, we recorded different aspects, but I didn't cover here the analysis of sensor data and so on. So instead, I covered based on self-report correlations and things like that. So for the first study, people, in fact, were wearing things you can't see probably, but under their t-shirt, there is like a belt that measures about things about their breathing and heart rate. And then there's this sensor on their wrist as well. So this measures muscle-related electrical activities on that wrist. And also from the virtual headset, we are taking also information regarding their head movements and so on. In terms of other physiological signals, in the past, I had a PhD student who worked with brain-related data. And I have a paper, we have a paper about this in the International Journal on Human-Computer Studies. So if you want, I can send you the link. But this was not health-related. So this was actually music-related, dyadic music interaction. So two people playing music together and how their behavior impact each other, both in terms of their performance, but also in terms of their nonverbal behavior. So overall, basically what we found is that with physiological signals, it is quite tricky because they're very susceptible to noise. So if you're doing movements, it's very susceptible and depends on what you use. So if you use just off-the-shelf physiological sensors, what you measure essentially could be just noise. It's difficult to say exactly what you're measuring because of all these challenges attributed to motion, even breathing sometimes. So if someone is breathing very deeply, even that can affect what you're getting as signal. So it's very difficult to actually claim what is being analyzed is necessarily brain signals, for instance. With heart, even with heart rate, in fact, it is supposed to be much easier and reliable. But even there, we found depends on the person. So for some people, it's a bit more obvious. For some other people, sometimes depends even on their skin conductivity as well. If you want to measure electrodermal activity, some people somehow the signals are not recorded and we are not really sure why that is the case, or their response is very low. So even if you normalize per person, sometimes you don't get much if there's movement. So if it's very controlled studies, people are not moving, but they're just watching, for instance, videos. So you're eliciting only their responses to watching a video. So they're seated, they're not moving, and they don't really move their head either if it's something on their head. You will see there are some studies in such situations because it's a bit easier, it's much more controlled. But if we start moving towards the other study I mentioned, for instance, in this one, the person is moving not only their head, but they're moving around the room as well. So it's much trickier to involve these sensors. That has been my experience over the years, but I'm happy to hear about your comments and feedback as well. Poonam, I think you're talking, but you're muted, so I'm not sure what you're saying.
Sorry, thank you. There's another question from Ibrahim. He says, thank you for your talk. It was wonderful. Could you share some of the research articles related to this talk?
Should I just type on the chat? I can send. So the two latest ones are on archive already. So I can just share the link on the chat. Would that work, Poonam, or do you prefer? I think on the slides, I couldn't put the archive link when I created this because it was not yet published. Only yesterday, I think we have the archive out for the mindfulness coach. So it's out only yesterday.
So what we can do is, if you can provide us the updated slides, we will put those in our website. And also there will be link of the video on our YouTube channel for someone who would like to go back and have a look on the video again, on the talk,